Clown class matters. Don't let anybody tell you different.
Right. Hello, and welcome to Design Adjacent, the podcast that talks about the nexus of design, both today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Benny F. Johnson, and today, our guest is an artist, a leader, facilitator, and program designer. Our guest is none other than Regina Bain, who currently serves as the executive director of the Louis Armstrong House Museum in New York. She's worked for the last 2 decades in experience in building nonprofits, capacity, and arts and growth organizations. Prior to coming to the Louis Armstrong House Museum, she served as the vice president of the Posse Foundation, a national leadership and college access program, which helps send teams of students to top colleges and universities. It's through her work there as the deputy to the COO that she was able to provide insight and executive directors for their 10 site offices throughout the United States. She's worked to help drive and develop organizations that have helped change the future for students and young leaders. Regina is deeply committed to social justice and has used her background to facilitate and train others in having conversations around social identity, leadership, and group dynamics. It's through her work as both a supporter of the arts, a nonprofit leader, and an artist herself that we'd love to bring her today to our podcast. So without further ado, I welcome Regina to our Design Adjacent podcast today.
It is wonderful to be here. Hello.
It's so great to have you here in this moment. Full disclosure for everybody, Regina and I have known each other since our days at college. So
yes, we have.
It's been wonderful to watch how your impact in the world and career has evolved over time. And you started in your role as executive director of the Louis Armstrong House Museum shortly after I took over at AIGA. I still remember reaching out to congratulate you on that role.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a bit about this transformation and kind of journey. You spent about 15 or so years with the Posse Foundation, doing work with students and providing access to college and life beyond. And then, but always having art and culture as a part of your world. And then you take this pivot to take on this executive leadership role. Give us a little bit about that transition for you.
So I'll start all the way back to college. I majored in theater and African American studies, and then went on to get my MFA from the Yale School of Drama. And so I was an actress. I was performing out in the world, but at the same time, I was always volunteering to help kids, to do playwriting workshops for kids, to do different things. And I volunteered to lead a staff training exercise for the Posse Foundation. And that's when the opportunity came to be full-time at the Posse Foundation. At the time, I said, but wait, I'm an actress. Should I be doing this? And so it was that mix of figuring out my place as an artist and my place as a leader and an educator. And so that evolved into 17 years with Posse. And definitely the things that I learned as an artist are directly applicable to what it means to cultivate young leaders, to cultivate thoughtful dialogue. And then I looked around and I said, it's time for me to put art and education together in an even more deliberate way.
Right.
And that led me to the Louis Armstrong House Museum, institution that is dedicated to a musician who's also a performer broadly and a collage artist, which many people don't know about, and to think about arts education, music education, and how it affects well-being. So that put it all together for me. And so I took the leap in the midst of the pandemic, and it's been a good leap.
And we're so grateful and glad that you did. When I look at the program, we were talking in some of the work that we're doing, your name and the museum come up all the time in ways I haven't even shared. I've had meetings and someone said, I'm working with Regina over at the museum in these surprising ways. Recently, we had a conversation with all staff of my leadership team, and we mentioned we were going to have this conversation. And several members of my team talked about their experience recently engaging with the museum and talking about what the museum and the work has meant to them. And I think it's really powerful that you're able to kind of combine this together. Your love.
That's beautiful to hear.
Yeah, it's been that kind of refreshing, surprising moment. I was like, we definitely have to have this conversation. When I think about your role, it's interesting. I think I first met you through your voice and through music. before we met, I think I met hearing you sing and hearing your interaction. So when I heard that you were going to take on this leadership role, I know that that's kind of a core part of you. So how has that been leading this organization that has music and art in its culture as an active artist yourself?
Mm-hmm.
How does that inspire you or challenge you, if anything, as you kind of serve this different capacity?
Yes. Well, I think about what it means to serve artists and also what it means to preserve an institution,
right,
and to preserve a legacy. And the Louis Armstrong House Museum is very much about preserving a legacy. We are a museum. We are a historical site. And there is a great deal of research and scholarly work that's done. But at the same time, the museum has always been dedicated to contemporary music and present day music. But it was just a little bit buried underneath the historical mission of preserving and sharing the legacy of Louis Armstrong. And so what I've gotten to do in the past year and a half is bring what was always happening to the forefront. And say we are not only about preserving the legacy, but we are about engaging contemporary artists to create new work. And that's what we've done. And we've been able to get commissions out to artists working right now. In fact, right now, we are looking for 2 groups of artists for $10,000 commissions for a program we're calling Armstrong Now, that would have them research in our archives and in the historic home and create new works. So I want contemporary artists to be a part of this legacy, to know they're a part of it and to give them space to shine.
It's really great to hear how you're digging into the work and the legacy and using that as the material going forward. So if you think of Armstrong as a collagist, you're often taking material that's pre-printed and then reinterpreting and presenting it forward. One of the other spaces in which you recently showed up in kind of our world and exploration, we were working with the NEA, and I saw recently that you and the museum and a project that you're working on was just recently awarded one of the NEA grants for this year. Tell a bit about this kind of unique project that really fits in our design space, and one of the reasons we wanted to talk today.
Yes.
The work about jazz and hip hop heritage sites. Talk a bit about this.
So the Jazz and Hip Hop Map of Queens is what we are creating. And the National Endowment for the Humanities has awarded us a discovery grant. So we're in the beginning exploratory phase, and hopefully we'll move on to prototyping to production. It was inspired by Flushing Town Hall's Queens Jazz Trail. That was produced in the 90s. So it was a map that you put on the wall with this gorgeous artistry related to it. And I saw that on the wall of the museum. And I said, what is that? That's excellent. We need to do more with that. And so that started a conversation about how to digitize that wall map and how to have it connected to stories and to have it not just be about jazz, but about hip hop. And there are so many connections, familial connections between current day hip hop artists who had jazz artists as their uncles, as their dads, as their mothers, and who gave them the equipment, who gave them the musical ear to create the music that they do now. And so we want to tell that story and tell it about Queens, because often the story of jazz is told through Harlem and the story of hip hop is told through the Bronx or Brooklyn. But Queens has a unique story to tell because of its geography, because of the way things work. I was talking to someone, an artist, and he said, Queens is different because there are homes with garages and basements. And so literally they would roll down the street in their car or walking and listen to who was practicing. And then they would hang out and sometimes be invited in. And there's something about the geography of Queens that allowed for that. And so we want to plot that on a map and then connect that to stories.
I love the premise of the project. And in our world, with the designers we're referring, wayfinding, story making, and tracking, those are all things that our community really spends a lot of time digging in and thinking about it and seeing this connection that you're able to take these heritage sites and spin it on its edge a bit. I think about in my own family, my son's interaction with music not only comes from me, but it comes from spending time in the basement with his grandfather. Who has access to all of the music, published and unpublished. and this connection point that comes in, and how I'm often surprised where their lyrics or refrains that he knows as a 13-year-old that are completely outside of 2 to 3 generations of his experience. And I wonder, as you said, that those magical but important moments, you see that in Silicon Valley, if you look at why does technology grow? Because of the engineers and the connection and the houses in the community. The same thing happens for culture.
Yes.
So as you think about these projects, what have been some of the challenges you've had to overcome? And this is kind of expanded thinking for the space. Typically, heritage museums stay in one lane.
Yes.
I'm not afraid to say that's typically what has happened. So talk a bit about how you've brought this refreshing innovation and disruption to the space.
Well, definitely a challenge is just capacity of people. We're a small team. We are small but feisty.
Nice.
And there's a lot of work to be done in caring for a historic home, and in doing that in the midst of a pandemic when we're all had to switch to online programming, new ways of working for us, new skills to learn. A lot for a small but mighty team. At the same time, in the tradition of Louis Armstrong, the museum has always cared about community.
Right.
So Louis was a megastar. He was a multimillionaire. He lived in Corona, Queens, a modest community and with a modest home. And he loved it. And he stayed for 30 years. And so part of our responsibility to continue that legacy is to continue to love and care for and tell the stories of our community. Right. And we have the resources and expertise around archiving, around history recording that could do that. So when you think about the values of Louis Armstrong, it makes complete sense that we are doing this jazz and hip hop map of Queens, because Louis Armstrong would have cared about that and would have wanted to tell that story and put his resources to that. So it's in complete alignment once you think about values. And so now, how to get the work done, that can only be done in partnership. And so that's why we need to work with Flushing Town Hall, the Kupferberg Center for the Arts, Queens Library. There's a host of advisors who all have expertise and experience, because this can't just be ours. It has to belong to the peoples whose stories it is. And so that's how we're going to get it done, to not do it alone, but to do it in community.
And Armstrong was a true kind of magnet in this space, and being there for 30 years, you think of all the people he brought through to come through to see him.
They would come by the den and sit down and visit with Louis, with Pops. And that includes all the other jazz luminaries who lived in Queens. That includes Dizzy Gillespie and Jimmy Heath. They were all there, and they would come by and say hello and hang out. And Louis would record them, sometimes secretly, as they talked together. Different times. But we have all those recordings in our archives. Wow. And so that is when contemporary artists come and do research in our archives, that's some of the things that they're listening to. The ambiance of a party, which Louis Armstrong recorded in his home.
What's been the most surprising thing for you as you've kind of transitioned as an artist, principally, then as a trainer and facilitator, to now as a leader in a nonprofit space? What has surprised you along the way?
That there are some skills that are completely differentiated. And then there are some skills that translate in surprising ways. So the differentiated skill, as an executive director, I have to raise our budget. And that is a responsibility that stays with me. I have to make sure all of our folks are paid and we have the money to do our programming. And that's a differentiated skill that's different than what I do as an artist, as a facilitator. But then there is the baseline skill that I learned as an actress, which is what it means to listen and respond.
Nice.
And actually, some people who know me have probably heard this story, what I learned through clown class. Okay. So in drama school,
do tell.
I took a class called Clown. And there are lots of different types of clowning, but this particular type of clown workshop was about what it means to enter a room, to allow people to laugh at you and to leave, and to do that repeatedly. And what it taught me was what it means to be absolutely vulnerable,
Right.
and open to the people in front of me, and yet secure enough in my own well-being with a core that is rooted that I can allow people to laugh at my foibles and my faults.
Okay.
And we can be together in that moment, and then I can leave. And so where I've used those skills as a leader is to be able to enter into rooms of uncertainty, to listen closely, to allow people to see my faults with the things that I do not know, and yet to assert myself in the knowledge and truth that I have, to make the statements I need to make and to move things forward, and then to leave and move on. And I've done that in rooms with people who have much more power than I. I've done that in rooms with people who I don't know, who are maybe not as powerful as I in different ways, and I need to make space for. It's been an incredible skill to have and to apply. So that's the translatable skill.
Okay.
And then there's just the straight up, I need to make some money for my folks so that we can keep moving things forward. So all those have been surprises for me as I move into the role.
So we mentioned a bit about space and making space. So I'd love to explore that both as a metaphor, but also talking about space. You're on the verge of opening up an additional space for the work that you do. So you have the principal house, but talk a bit about what's next on the horizon.
Yes.
Physically. And then let's talk about what space we're trying to create going forward.
Yes. So physically, the historic home of Louis and Lucille Armstrong exists on 107th Street in Corona, Queens.
Nice.
It is there for everyone to come and see and have tours through this gorgeous space. Right now, we're open Thursday through Saturday and has been open for decades. Next door is a gorgeous Japanese-inspired garden that Lucille created for Louis when he had heart attacks and needed to recover. And so she built this space of peace. And so it's next door to the historic home. Also next door to the historic home is something called Selma's Place. So Selma Geraldo was the neighbor who supported Louis and Lucille. And when she passed, she donated her home to the museum. And so now that is becoming a part of our campus.
Okay.
And then across the street is the new Louis Armstrong Center. It is a 14,000 square foot building that's been 15 years in the making. It's going to house a 75-seat jazz club. It's going to have a new exhibit that's multimedia being curated by jazz pianist and multimedia artist Jason Moran. And it's going to house the archives, the physical archives, that's 60,000 pieces. It's the largest archive of any jazz musician, one of the largest of any Black musician. All of that is going to be on 107th Street in Queens in this new building. And so we are in the midst of construction. We're working with incredible people to get it done.
It's incredible in this space. And you mentioned another artist who I just have deep respect and love for, with Jason Moran and his practice that is about space, that's also sound and history and memory. So I'm going to deviate from my question before and ask you this question. If you could put together your dream backing band and ensemble, who would be in it?
Oh, Lord, Benny, Benny.
I'm getting you in trouble today.
Why do you do this to me? Oh, my goodness. So I think about skill, and then I think about heart and what it means to interact on a heart level with people. And there are so many people who I would love to have a heart connection with in order to create some music. I can't name names. Benny, you are not going to do this to me.
That was a beautiful answer. I'm going to let you off the hook with that because we have skill and heart connection and space in there. So I will send you a list of who I think we should see at the club when it opens up at the space.
Yes, please.
And
I would love that.
We'll get back together on our podcast and we'll talk about whether or not you and I made it happen. But no.
All right.
But it's an incredible thing to think about team and when we build people together in team. I think what you said is a great metaphor for that. People you bring together with skill and those who have with heart. When we talk about a lot of work with teams, we can always teach skill. You can't always teach heart. And if bring that together to have the commitment to the mission. How has it been for you in coming in, as a first time executive director with a deep interest in art and culture and taking on a new team. And, we both had the mix of taking on a new team, and I'll add one to that during the midst of the pandemic.
Yes.
What kind of, as you've had some time, what kind of leadership lessons were you able to draw from that? And what are some of the challenges, candidly, that you've had to deal with in kind of bringing a team together in this moment?
Yes. So I think for this particular team, many of them have been with the organization for a very long time, have a deep dedication, and have worked tirelessly to make things happen in the midst of the pandemic. And I came in August of 2020. So they have been working for months in the midst of uncertainty, and making magic in the midst of that. And so I think part of my entry was, who's this person who's going to be our leader? We've been doing it. We've been making it happen without an executive director. And so part of it was about building trust, being a listener, but also having a vision and saying where this vision comes from. So for me, the vision is to continue to preserve and share the legacy of Louis Armstrong, but to live the Armstrong values and to have all the work that we do come out of that. And when I say the Armstrong values, I mean both Louis and Lucille. So Lucille is Armstrong's wife, who was a Cotton Club dancer, who bought the home that is now our historic home that we have the tours through. She bought it with her own money because Louis didn't want to buy it. So she said, well, I'm going to do this myself. And she said, next time you come off of the tour bus, come here. This is where we live now. So there's an incredible legacy for Lucille to celebrate. And so when I say the Armstrong values, I mean of both of them. And those values of artistic excellence, education, and community. And so I think once you enter from a listening space and enter with values, that goes a long way towards building trust. One of the things I love about jazz, I love about music generally, but when I see and listen to live jazz, I love to watch people listen to each other. And when I see an improvisational jazz band, well, that's what I get to do. I get to watch people listen. And in the midst of listening and creating at the same time. And that I think that is part of my charge as a leader. How do I create an incredible jazz improvisational band with my team that I am the band leader of, but I am not at the front of the stage? How do we listen? How do we create at the same time and move quickly and swiftly as we have to do in our current climate, but still have a sound that can be listened to? And that's the lesson of music for me, the lesson of jazz, and the lesson that I've been trying to take into my approach to leadership at this organization. It's hard. Jazz is not easy. It takes skill and dedication.
That's not for the faint, right?
It's not for the faint hearts. You can't come up in here thinking that you know things without doing the work, but I'm doing the work, and that's been good.
We think about kind of jazz's impact, and we're talking about the kind of world today. One of the things that I think we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up is take us back to 1955, before either of us were here, right? Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was at the heart of pushing this idea that American jazz artists could be on the forefront of diplomacy and democracy. And seeing both Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie perform all around the world at a challenging time for the U.S., but as Black jazz musicians opening up the idea of American-born creativity throughout the world. As you kind of champion the legacy and space in there, what role do you have in thinking about kind of the global presence of the art form and the creativity? I think about the heritage sites when we talk about jazz and hip hop, which are no longer refined to the continuous 48s, but are really, without question, impact our world globally. What are the things that you think about now in kind of his legacy as an ambassador and a champion for creativity globally?
Yes. So Louis Armstrong traveled to over 62 countries. his legacy is definitively global.
Right.
And that is a part of the programming that we want to create, the global ambassadors. So at some point when we're ready to take musicians, historians, and young people around the world in Louis Armstrong's footsteps to have a global exchange of music and ideas. That's coming. We've taken baby steps toward it by working with the Forum for Cultural Engagement, who partners with embassies across the world. And so we did a program actually with the U.S. Embassy in Russia, where we brought concerts based on the Real Ambassadors album to students and people in Russia through the U.S. Embassy and with the Forum for Cultural Engagement. And it was beautiful. And we want to continue to do that with other embassies across the world. All that was virtual because it was happening during the pandemic, but eventually to physically go to these spaces. And I think about what it means to be a Black person representing America, and how Louis Armstrong was a Black man representing America, and he knew the power of that. And he actually declined to use that power with the Little Rock. Mm-hmm. And so the State Department wanted to send him to Russia to represent. But at the same time, there were a group of students who were attempting to integrate a school in Arkansas. And they were met with a mob, and Eisenhower was not responding in the way that Louis Armstrong wanted. And Louis Armstrong spoke to that and said, you know what, I don't think now is the right time for me to go to Russia to represent in this way. So he was aware of the power of his presence and of his representation, and he wanted to use it in a thoughtful way. And that's something we want to do too now as the museum. But we know there's incredible power there of dialogue and exchange.
One of the things that's important as we talk about is our creative agency and the intention and how we present. One of the photos that I love to look at and we talk about for his relationship with his wife. There's a great black and white photograph of him in front of the Sphinx in the Great Pyramids of Giza. And he has the trumpet and he's basically serenading, saluting his wife in the space of this. And to see him taking jazz and the music throughout the world and going back to what we said before and having this tribute to his family and center. So we talk about the house, and you said before, he wasn't really a big fan of the house at the beginning. When did that change? When did it become that this is, so much of his life we talk about, the house is such a central part of it. It is home. Yeah. And it's fun for me to hear you say, like, he didn't want the house. His wife didn't care. You get in the house. And how did that change to this is the center of his world now?
Yes. Well, first I have to talk about the image that you just talked about of he and Lucille in Egypt in front of the pyramids and the Sphinx. That is actually the image that Jason Moran has talked about as the inspiration for the exhibit that he's creating. And that exhibit he's titled Here to Stay. And when he's talked about it, he said that the pyramids are revered, they are protected, they are here to stay. And that the house on 107th Street has to be revered and protected in the same way. Right. And there is that we're all in that legacy. And undergirding that is a love and commitment with Louis and Lucille that is a part of the foundation of that. And so the reason why I think he stayed in Corona on 107th Street was partly because of Lucille, but also because this is a place where he could walk down the street as a megastar and just be normal. When he went to Manhattan and walked down the street, he was mobbed. He was a star. But when he walked down the street in Queens, the kids would come and they would run up to him and he could just be walking with them. He could go to the barber around the street. He could go to his rice and beans joint. He could do what he wanted to do as what he thought of himself as a working class man who went to work with his trumpet and then came home to be with his family. And that's what he had at that home in Queens. And that's what he did not want to give up. He was there to stay. It's
powerful as you tell the story of us making the idea of home and what that means. independent of traveling the world, independent of the fame and the space in there, to talk about those simple things that are so important and reinforce home for us. Mm-hmm. I often, when we have our conversations, we often ask the question as to what advice would you give to those following in our footsteps, right? The students who are navigating school today, the young professionals here, what advice would you give in finding their path or their professional home?
Clown class matters. Don't let anybody tell you different.
Right.
There are going to be some obscure classes that you take, especially if you are a part of a liberal arts education, that you might be unsure of. How does this play? And that your parents may be unsure of. How does this play into your career goals? How will this help you? Sometimes you have to make those connections for yourself. But if you think deeply and thoroughly about the studies that you are engaging with, you can make connections to the rest of the world. So one of the reasons why stories and artwork that is about a particular group of people or a particular way of thinking that goes deep in that way connects to the rest of humanity is because it goes deep in that way. So it's okay to go deep into the study of one particular thing, as long as you then look up and out and make the connections to the rest of the world, to translate the skills, to translate the learning. So go deep, be thoughtful, and look up so that you can connect with the rest of the world.
Nice. And my final question for you. What's inspiring you today? What gives you that additional push, the kind of wellspring of ideas and inspiration today?
When I see two people listening to each other and making music, when I see people fighting for their lives through war, when I see people acknowledging war and being willing to say, even in the midst of that, there has been racism, when I see people trying to protect their humanity and their joy by walking away from the conversation about war and racism and thinking about peace, all of those are moments that inspire me, because it's about, for me, it's about fighting for truth in the moment that I am in right now with people. And so I look for the moments as much as I can, because they're always there. I just have to see them.
Well, I can't believe that our time has come to an end. But I will say, I'm smiling, and it's a joy to watch how you've grown and your work has progressed to this moment. It's kind of the perfect combination in thinking of as an artist, as a leader, as a visionary, and as an inspirational healer. Regina, thank you for spending this afternoon and for us to have a chance to just share and talk about the world around us, the impact that music and home can have, and the opportunity we have when we come together to talk. Thank you. I
appreciate you so much, Benny. Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for joining us for this episode of Design Adjacent. We also invite you to check out our upcoming podcast where we explore the world both today and tomorrow and the impact that design has. And we encourage you to check out the Louis Armstrong House Museum, whether you're in New York or online. Thank you once again.
Show notes for this episode will be available on aiga.org. Please subscribe to our show on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. AIGA's Design Adjacent podcast and its contents are the copyright of AIGA, the Professional Association for Design. All rights reserved. Any redistribution or reproduction of part or all of the content in any form is prohibited without AIGA's express written permission. My name is Li Shan Huang. Until next time.